Welcome to Researcher Revealed, the podcast where we go behind the name that was on a paper or conference proceeding and get to know the researcher who created or wrote that paper. We find out about their journey, why they're doing the research that they're doing, and just generally get to know them a little bit better. On today's episode, we have Dr. Gemma Clunie joining us. She is a speech language pathologist or speech language therapist, depending on which country you're in. And she's going to share with us all about her journey as a clinical academic and how she got into research. I hope you enjoy. And welcome to the next episode on Researcher Revealed. On today's episode, we have the lovely Gemma, who's joining us, and she's a speech language pathologist or otherwise SLT, just so that everybody knows some of the acronyms that we're probably going to go into today. Gemma, can you say hi to everybody for us?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
A little bit about who you are, where you work. Sorry, I forgot to say that. Introduce yourself.
Sorry. So I'm a speech and language therapist. I work at Imperial College London Healthcare NHS Trust, which is in West London. And I am also affiliated to Imperial College London, which is where I did my PhD. My clinical area of specialism is within the ENT and head and neck cancer world, and my PhD research sort of sat within the benign ENT disease world.
Thank you. Now, everybody, if you're a first-time listener to this podcast, the first thing we like to do here on Researcher Revealed is do what I call the Rapid 11. And this is just 11 quick, easy questions, just to get a little bit more background on who you are, how you work, your favorite things, that sort of thing, just a little bit of fun. So are you, Gemma, ready for the Rapid 11?
I think so.
It's honestly not that scary. Right, first question,
Okay.
Very complicated. Are you a Windows or Mac user?
Windows.
Okay, you're joining the majority there. Are you a tea or coffee drinker?
Both, but if I had to choose one, tea. I'm British. I think there might be some sort of unwritten law. I don't know.
No,
and it has to be Yorkshire tea. Actually, I should add that in.
Ooh.
And I don't think I would be allowed to drink other kinds of tea.
You're the second person who's like, I do drink both, but if it's tea, it has to be Yorkshire. So yeah. You're in good company. Excellent. Next question. When you're writing, do you prefer music or sounds, or are you silence?
I'm a silence person. I'm a silence person for lots of stuff, actually. Like even running, I do quite a lot of running, and I don't run with headphones or music, which a lot of people find completely baffling. And I'm pretty much the same with writing.
Interesting. Is there a reason behind that? Or is it just what feels natural?
I guess it's what feels natural. With writing, I think I do generally find it quite distracting. There were occasions when I was writing my thesis where I would have music playing, and I'm not quite sure what would sort of what that exactly meant at the time, but majority of time nothing. And certainly with running, part of it's also headphones are just really annoying when you're trying to move. I haven't found a way of keeping. I think I've got weird ears. That might be another reason.
I love that. Fair enough. I think for me, one of the things I'm finding, so I originally designed the Rapid 11 just as like a nice, easy way to start the podcast. But what I'm finding really interesting is how much better I'm getting to know people because of them, and like whether that's just because they prefer silence or, it's interesting. Next question. What time of day are you the most productive?
So this varies loads for me. I think when I was younger, I'd have definitely been like, I was clearly a morning person, and then I had children and they broke me. And so I'm not convinced I'd describe myself as a morning person anymore, although that it is always lightly my preference to try and get things done earlier in the day. However, I know that over the last few years, I can sometimes find myself being like incredibly productive, like after they've gone to bed for a couple of hours.
Interesting.
So it's shifted, and I think it varies. Yeah.
I think there's like some sort of like productivity study there. Like so many of the researchers, clinical researchers, health researchers that I've talked to have all talked about how, as a mum, that they are more productive in the evenings because children have gone to bed, they're able to have clear space, the day is done. And so you're not alone with that. There's definitely some sort of productivity study there. If
Yeah. And
anybody
then
out there is interested.
I mean, I think the most productive I ever am is if I've got like a clear day of no meetings, like and then it doesn't actually matter the times of day.
Yeah.
I think it's just not having to keep switching between tasks. Like I'm someone who quite needs to be able to hyper focus, I'd say. And yeah, so that's a factor for my productivity.
I really like that. I listened to a podcast like ages ago and they talked about how multitasking is a lie that the modern world tells ourselves, and that actually it's switching, and task switching makes you less productive because it takes a lot longer than you realize for your brain to switch gears from task A to task B. So
yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Excellent. Right, this is my favorite question, just to see how people react to it, is what is your favorite referencing manager or system?
Do you know what? I use EndNote, and I'm going to touch wood here because as yet EndNote hasn't self-destructed on me. And I know that it has on like a million people, but it hasn't. And so I continue to use it and it seems okay. And I used it for my thesis and it was fine. And I'm definitely tempting some sort of horrific,
Touch
like
wood,
it will just
really
get rid of
quickly. Touch
everything. It won't
wood.
have next time I open it, there won't be any references anymore or something. And as a backup, I
Don't
use
curse yourself.
yeah, as a backup, I use Mendeley, like the online,
Hmm.
just because, I mean, partly just because sometimes when you download papers, you kind of don't have any choice. It just puts them into Mendeley, doesn't it? So yeah.
I've recently started using Zotero and I've slightly fallen a bit in love with it.
Oh, really? I haven't even looked at that one.
So there's some functionalities that aren't as good as what EndNote has. So like I love the more advanced features of EndNote where like, I mean, you've probably come across this as well. You'll go to like Journal X and they'll be like, we want you to use Vancouver, but change these 12 rules.
Yeah.
And EndNote, in some of the more advanced features, you can actually go into and you can kind of create a journal specific rule.
Yeah.
And it's a bit fiddly, but then all you have to do is press a button and it's like magic and it's done. And I haven't figured out how to do that with Zotero. But sometimes in EndNote, when all you have is a PDF or a URL, sometimes you get all the information and other times you don't, and it can be a bit fiddly.
Yeah, it
Where
really
with
can.
Zotero, literally all you need is the URL and it's like magic. You don't even have to download the PDF if you don't want to. Like
that is exciting.
It's quite clever, that. Anyway, next question. Your favorite data visualization tool. So how do you make your graphs, figures, images, stuff like that?
Oh God, I'm probably a bit basic really when it comes to that. I'm reasonably competent using Excel for certain sort of more simple things. When I was for my PhD and for some of the papers that came from that, or for one of the papers that came from that, I used something called, I'm actually going to completely forget what it's called, so I'm just going to have to Origin. Yeah, there's a app called Origin Plot or Origin, I think it's just called, and that does some really lovely data visualization stuff that's quite sophisticated.
And is that like open source, or do you have to
it was free.
subscription it?
No, it was free to download, so I think it's open source, and it doesn't appear to have corrupted anything. So it's not like, but it was a recommendation actually from another now postdoctoral researcher who's more experienced than me, who's also a sort of healthcare professional. She's an OT, so I felt relatively safe trying it.
Love those sorts of top tips. Can you do me a favor?
Hmm.
Not currently, but after we finish recording this, can you drop the URL of that?
Yeah.
Because I'll put it into the episode description on both the podcast as well as the YouTube, so that if other people are like, I want to check that out, it'll make it easier, because I'm sure if you Google origins, you're going to have quite a few things to
It's gonna come up
choose
with
from.
some weird stuff, definitely.
It's one of those things where, like, sometimes you hear about something, you're like, oh, that's an easy Google. And then other times you're like, oh, can you be more specific?
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. Thank you, Gemma. Right, on to the more important things, food. What is your favorite desk snack?
Probably at the moment I'm quite keen on nuts, normally like almonds or cashews, and chocolate peanuts, or kind of essentially peanut M&Ms, but I get these ones that are
Ooh,
slightly fancier because they're dark chocolate. They're called Doisy D&Ms. They're called. I can't actually again remember.
nice.
I can also drop
Fancy
that
dark
link.
chocolate covered
But yeah,
nuts. I like the sound of that.
yeah, that would be my preference.
Nice.
And
Very
if
cool.
I have a cup of tea, maybe a biscuit, because
Fair
I
enough.
like to dunk.
Fair enough. I try not to have biscuits in the house. Because
Also fair
if I
enough.
did, I'd be the size of the house. Oh, so
Yeah, it's
I
best
don't
to
I
just
don't
not
do
have the
dunking.
temptation there, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, I'm terrible. Like, the only snack I allow myself to have in the house with any sort of regularity, other than on weekends, is nuts, because I have got the self-control of a toddler when it comes to food.
Fair enough.
Right. Next question. When planning, so whether that's a project, your life, whatever, are you a digital planner or are you a pen and paper girl?
I love lists and I write them down. So I think I have to say I've got a notebook. I always have a notebook. It's always got a to-do list in it. And that would be the same actually, whether it's at work or at home. I do recognize the value of doing things digitally, and I have like my calendar is online now. And that's important because I can share it across different platforms, and I have different email addresses and all of those sorts of things. So it's a kind of combination, but for the list
Fair enough.
making, it's definitely pen and paper.
Yeah,
I like being able to tick them off.
there's something there's something so satisfying about being able to tick something off, but I also find it really, for me anyways, really lovely, because you get that real sense of accomplishment. Because I find, especially in research, like, so many of our projects are so long and it can feel like you're not going anywhere. But if you have, like, I'm the same, I've got a journal, you've got that long sort of to-do list, then you can actually kind of see that you're progressing. And I absolutely love that. So I'm
Yeah.
with you there. Right. What book are you currently reading?
Hmm. Um, I just finished a fiction book called Quinn.
Hmm.
That was by an author called, I think, M. Russell. I'll double check that. So I read a lot of fiction. I always have done because my first degree was English literature. So
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
yeah, I went a very strange route into science that was not science for,
Oh, I can't wait to
for a
hear.
while. Um, and I really enjoyed it. Although it is quite a strange book. It's not by M. Russell, M. Strang. Um,
Strang.
EM, and then her surname is Strang. It's quite a poetic book, and it's not the easiest read, but I really enjoyed it. But I'm quite diverse in my reading tastes. I will read literally any genre, any. I'm not at all fussy. And I do also read nonfiction, but
Ah, nice. I'm
yeah.
the same. I I love reading. I didn't come to research through English lit, but um similar sounding to you. I absolutely love reading books. Right, last question on Rapid 11 is, who is a researcher that you admire? They can be alive, they can be somebody like historical, just somebody that you sort of look up to.
Gosh. I think the most obvious person for me to choose, and the one that I kind of think I wouldn't be here without her, is Professor Caroline Alexander, she's actually now a professor in practice at Imperial, but she's also the lead clinical academic for the NHS Trust. And she was my supervisor for one of my supervisors, my PhD, and she also is kind of ongoing as a mentor. And although our clinical areas are obviously very different, she's a musculoskeletal physiotherapist by background. I think any of us working at Imperial in clinical academia, or trying to make some degree of career in clinical academia, who work outside of medicine, have been, her role and her continuing passion to try and support the development of a career framework for us has just been phenomenal. And on a personal level, she is just the best mentor. And I think I know about her research. I understand that she researches pain and hypermobility and those sorts of things. But I think what I value her for and respect her for, and kind of the reason I want to be her when I grow up, is because she is so unfailingly supportive and responsive and present. And that is incredible.
Oh, I can't wait to dive into your journey a little bit more, because I think, like, we've come across each other through Facebook and your group that you created there, and I know a little bit about you, but I've been like so excited about this conversation because it's just selfishly, these podcasts are a really like brilliant way for me to get to know other people like you who have a clinical background, or who have other backgrounds, who are interested in health research and interested in making impactful research as non-medics. So yeah, with that being said, let's dive right in. And can you give us sort of like the highlights of how you as an SLT have entered into the crazy world of research?
Yeah. So I could go back to the English literature degree very briefly to say that I did English literature.
Start wherever
Yeah,
you
I'm
want.
going
If
to
you need
start
to
there.
start before SLT, start before SLT.
So I did that as an undergraduate, in very much that kind of, I was good at English literature. It was a well-respected course. I went to do it. It was great. At the time, I was quite strongly encouraged by a couple of my tutors to go down the sort of academic route of, a master's and a PhD, and potentially looking towards, teaching. But if I'm honest, I was needed a break from university, and was not convinced that English literature was necessarily adding a huge amount, like doing an academic career in English literature is necessarily going to, I don't know, be anything other than quite self-indulgent, or that's how it felt for me at the time, without offending anyone who has made those choices. And I went and taught English in Japan for a year, and did the sort of normal, I don't know what to do with my life kind of stuff that you do when you're 21. And then I'd always considered speech and language therapy as a career, and I came back from Japan and I did some like voluntary work and with some speech and language therapists, and I really liked it. So I got on to do the master's course at UCL, and then became a speech and language therapist and worked clinically for several years, without any engagement really in research at all, partly because I think of the places that I was working. So one of my reflections on becoming a kind of healthcare professional who's involved in research is that the location that you're based is really key, and the people that you're surrounded by is really key to kind of even make that a possibility for you in your head. I don't think it just didn't occur to me that it was an option in the other, and I worked basically in London hospitals. And then I moved to Imperial. I had some career wobbles, wasn't even sure I wanted to carry on being a speech and language therapist, all of those sorts of things. Moved to Imperial to do a very exciting clinical specialist role in the Airways ENT team. And in the interview for the job, I was asked where did I want to be in 5 years. And what came out of my mouth was I want to do a PhD. And if I'm honest, sorry, my eyes. If I'm honest, I don't think I'd thought about that until I was asked that question. But as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I think that is what I want to do.
Oh.
And so I got the job. It was a new service that I was setting up alongside Justin Rowe, who was already had his PhD. He was very, very well known, well respected speech and language therapist, and we were setting up the service. And you know, he was very keen on the idea of me doing a PhD and actually completing some research with this kind of very specific patient group that we were working with, that we both rapidly realised there wasn't really any evidence for. I should say, you know, again, working alongside someone like Justin, who has now also become a professor in practice at Imperial, and as I say, linking in with Caroline, who was in post there, it just made it this thing that I'd never really even thought about before, research, suddenly seemed completely feasible and like I wasn't going completely mad. I'm just gonna wipe my eye. And yeah, and that's sort of what that was it really. I was suggested to apply for charity funding from Imperial to do a pre-doctoral fellowship because I didn't have a research master's. I had a master's and I had a kind of small research project that had been involved in that. And I'd done audit and QI work up to that point in my career that kind of had vaguely transferable skills, but I didn't feel as though I had the sort of the proper research chops to go straight into a PhD. However, at the same time as applying for the pre-doctoral charity fellowship, I also applied to the what is now the DCAF scheme through the NIHR and was the clinical doctoral research fellowship scheme. Really just as a practice run, if I'm completely honest. I didn't expect to get the funding. And then I was asked for an interview after my application. And for context, I was asked for an interview when I was on maternity leave. So I attended the interview with my 10-week-old daughter and my husband. I breastfed before it and I breastfed after it. And I don't really have a memory of the interview because I was very sleep deprived.
Oh
And I fully
goodness.
expected, I fully expected not to get it because I didn't think I had the research experience to be able to get one of these sorts of fellowships. I'd heard how competitive they were, but then I did. So I didn't do the pre-doctoral charity fellowship, which I was also successful for, but didn't obviously need to proceed towards. I just went straight into a PhD fellowship when I came back from maternity leave when my daughter was 8 months old. And so, yeah, that was my route.
Wow. So, a couple of questions popped to mind. First off, you mentioned location is really key for you, and that sort of environment and the natural support that's around you. What do you think are like if somebody was like looking around is like, oh, I really want to do a PhD, is this the right place? What do you think are the key things that somebody should be looking for in a location if they want to build research into their clinical career?
I suppose there's a few things. I think particularly for those of us working outside of medicine and doing this, where there isn't a sort of clear career structure and you're kind of having to make it up as you go along. I think there are certain organisations, Imperial being one, where they're working quite hard to create that sort of career structure. I think there are other places. Southampton is somewhere that pops into my head where I think they're doing quite a lot of work around the kind of, I don't like the term non-medical, but you know, healthcare professionals outside of medicine who want to carry out research alongside their clinical work as well. And I think that is starting to become true elsewhere in the country as well.
Mm.
And those things are really important.
Yeah.
I think there is something about location and the people that is vital. So
Okay.
I joined a department that had 2 postdoctoral speech and language therapists already. So I've already mentioned
Okay.
Justin, who is a force to be reckoned with within speech and language therapy in terms of kind of how he has put us on the map, academic or clinical academically. But there is also Dr. Margaret Coffey, who is an astounding speech and language therapist and researcher as well. And I think being somewhere where you see, you can only be what you can see. So when you see it, you're like, this might be possible for me. And they've both been, incredibly supportive of the route that I've taken and helped me. There are now maybe questions around how many speech and language therapists with PhDs in one organisation is too many, because there's actually now another speech and language therapist with a PhD at Imperial as well, who works in paediatrics, called Mary Vivers, who's also wonderful. So it's great, but there's perhaps some limitations there, but it just takes conversations and kind of navigating spaces, I think. But you also need to be in an organisation that is going to be prepared to release you to do something like a PhD, and that is not necessarily going to be apparent at the point that you're interviewing or applying, but you can ask those sorts of questions at the point that you're interviewing and applying. And I think that my advice to someone who was considering that as a career pathway is to be really thoughtful about what you're kind of asking when you come into an organization, and look at what they've done before and who works there already, and try and do a little bit of due diligence as well.
Great tips. I love it. So both people as well as the organization. That leads me on to the next question. So you talked about the people. So thinking back on like that accidental spilling out of your mouth being like, ooh, I want to do a PhD. What do you think was it like reflecting back now? Do you think it was the knowledge of these other individuals at Imperial or other people that you saw that kind of fed that? Or do you think that was as much as, within the English department, you could see that people were doing research and I don't disagree with you, but there's a difference between doing research that's going to impact people and then research that is answering interesting questions. And they might edify you, they might make something a little bit more interesting, but it's not the same as, in my humble opinion, as like research that's going to change a treatment or a healthcare pathway. So do you think it was that knowledge that research existed even within the more academic ivory tower environment that sort of inspired you, or do you think it was the observation of other individuals in healthcare that were non-medics doing research?
I think maybe some of it was the sort of latter, so the kind of observation of non-medics, possibly, but I think that was quite subconscious. I think that I was a clinician seeking a space that I felt was my space.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, I had worked in, by that stage, 3 different organizations, and in more than one role in a couple of those organizations, encompassing both NHS and private healthcare settings. And I'd worked predominantly as a clinician, not as a manager. I had had some line management experience that I had not enjoyed, and that I don't think I did very well, because I think I was one of those people that kind of, it just came to me quite quickly, and I don't think I was really ready for it. And I think that probably both I and the people that I was supposed to be line managing suffered as a result of that. And I think that then my next role sort of took me away. I deliberately moved somewhere where, well, I locumed for a little bit, and then I was more of a clinical specialist, which felt better, but still didn't quite get to the kind of crux of what I wanted to do with my career. And I think then moving into this organisation and being asked this question, I came back to this space where I was like, I think research is just where I'm going to fit. I think, that kind of trajectory as a clinician where you can go and be a specialist or you can go and be a manager, but there's not much else. It was like this alternative route, and it felt right. And in doing it, I am 100 times more sure that it is the right choice. Like, it's the space that I belong in comparison to any of the other options that I maybe have as a clinician.
I love that answer, because I think, like, for me, it rings very true to my experience as well, and just like that natural, like when I started my PhD, I can remember one of my supervisors saying to me, like, how shocked they were at how quickly I took to it, and it was just like, this is home.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you've mentioned the word, so we know how you got into research. It's sort of likely something that was innate in you, a desire to ask questions, to find answers. In kind of your journey, you've kept using this word clinical academic. Now, this word, or words, phrase, you're the English lit expert.
I don't think anyone knows.
Exactly. So I feel that word, that term, let's call it a term, the term of a clinical academic, is used to cover a lot of sins. So medics use it, um, and increasingly other healthcare professionals are starting to use it as well. Just to give context for you, what do you believe that means?
Okay, so for me, I mean, there are literally papers written on the subject, so I feel like I need to caveat this with it's very much my own opinion. If you want a really good paper about it, Lisa Newington's written one. But for me, clinical academic is I guess you use the term clinician researcher, and I think it's someone who wants to carry out research in a clinical space whilst also working clinically. I am conscious that there are people who are employed by universities who would also describe themselves as clinical academics and are not necessarily working in a similar type of clinical space. And I think that it can encompass those individuals as well. It's just that the kind of clinical academic balance is different, I suppose, in my head. But I think it's a term that has to do quite a lot of legwork because there simply isn't a better descriptor. And I know that in the paper that Lisa and colleagues wrote, there was a sort of decision to use clinical academic as the term. I think I'm right in recalling this, with the acknowledgement that there were lots of other things that could be used to describe the same individuals and maybe used in other projects or other work. I think sometimes you just have to pick something and stick with it.
Oh, I'm with you there, and I think it's more important that, when you're discussing it, or it comes up, that you do what you've just done. So you describe how it is for you. So you see yourself as a clinical academic who is a clinical researcher. So for you, what does that look like in practicality? Do you have two contracts? Do you have one contract? How do you make this happen?
So I am in an extreme at the moment. I'm in an extremely fortunate position in that my substantive post is has the title of senior clinical academic, and I am employed by the NHS Trust. But I have 2 days research time within my full-time contract. The job that I'm doing is not properly my job. It's actually Dr. Margaret Coffey, who I mentioned earlier. It's her job, but she's gone to do an advanced fellowship with NIHR. So I'm kind of her backfill for I've been doing it about a year, and I've got another 2 years to go as she finishes her fellowship. The this is an initiative that has come about through the work of Caroline Alexandrov, who I've already mentioned, and Mary Wells, who's our Professor of Nursing, who is also a phenomenal individual.
I love
who
Mary.
has worked exactly as a nurse, you will know her. And they've worked incredibly hard to try and get these positions. And actually, I think Caroline has had more success, as I understand, within therapies than Mary has within nursing at the moment. But hopefully that will shift. So there's a senior clinical academic occupational therapist, a senior clinical academic speech and language therapist, and a senior clinical academic dietitian. And then Caroline obviously is the physio, so she kind of fits that. So the funding, I am still supposed to seek external funding for my research time, but because it is built into my contract, even without that, I would still have research time. So there's still a scrabble for funding there, but I'm very lucky.
I was going to say, but it sounds like to me, like that sounds like such a, like you say, a fortunate position to be in, because it gives you that security of being that temporary job security. Because in research, let's be honest, very few people have got permanent job security, because I view research very much now as like more of entrepreneurial model rather than any other sort of model, where if you're going to excel, you constantly have to be going out and seeking funding, and then you use that funding to build capacity, and eventually you'll get more security around it, because you'll just be too immovable because you've been successful enough at obtaining external funding. But there are positions like yours in the UK, as well as other people. I know Lindsay Welsh has gotten a very unique opportunity as well down at Bournemouth University, where she's got protected research time. And again, the expectation, similar to you, is that she does scrabble around for more funding, but at least she's got that security of guaranteed protected research time to facilitate that scrabble, where I know a lot of people don't get that protected time for the scrabble. And then when they're successful, that's how they buy their research time, is it's through grant money that they bring in. So that just, I think, is really important to talk about these things, because I think, like, I know when I first started my PhD, and I don't know if you were similar, whether, because at Imperial had a bit of a different situation. There's a lot of talk about this dream of a clinical academic, but very few people talk about the practicalities of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's true.
And the struggles that go around it. So that's kind of, yeah. So speaking of struggles, how we met. So you've talked about location being really important, and you've described how for you were in a really fortunate position and you had good mentors, good support around you. So what then inspired you to create Hyper, and what is Hyper?
So I suppose I didn't create it, and I definitely shouldn't take credit for that. Hyper, or as it is now, as it's known, it stands for Healthcare Professionals in Research. And it is hosted on Facebook, which is not my favorite social media platform, and I exist there under a pseudonym purely for the group. Well, not a pseudonym, it is my name because you have to, but it's sort of,
we won't tell the secret behind it.
It's a secret. I became involved in it because Janet Dean, she did her PhD at Imperial, and she remained at Imperial for a little while as a postdoctoral researcher, but then she moved. I think she's now an assistant professor up in Manchester, or an associate professor. She was a physiotherapist who was based in the same lab that I was linked to for my PhD, and she found her situation as a sort of a clinician researcher quite isolated. So unlike me, she didn't have a substantive post within the trust. She had come into Imperial through Arthritis UK and through her supervisor, Professor Alison McGregor, who was both of our primary supervisors and is also an amazing person. That's an aside. But she felt a little bit like she just didn't have a community of like-minded professionals around her doing her PhD. There were kind of other PhD students, but they weren't healthcare professionals necessarily. They might be bioengineers or possibly surgeons, or they were very different remits. And so she started, I think this is right, a writing group, or sort of a kind of, let's all come together and write. And this was all before COVID, so it was in person. And then she got some money from Imperial College, another charity, small charity fund, to establish a social media presence of some kind, initially just for Imperial-based researchers, to try and put us all kind of virtually in touch with each other. And again, this was before COVID, so it was quite innovative.
Yeah.
And then she was initially involved, and she wanted some other people to become involved in the project and to kind of help her run it, or to take it on from her, really, because she was coming to the end of her PhD and knew that she would probably be moving on. So myself and it was Ruth Barker, who I think you've also spoken to, and there was a nurse called Calandra Feather, and actually Margaret Coffey, the speech and language therapist I mentioned, was also, I think, involved early on. And then sort of there's been some various iterations of different community managers, but Ruth and I have stayed involved from the very beginning. And it's essentially a safe space on the internet within Facebook that is a private group for anybody who is interested in research and is a healthcare professional, but we're not including doctors or dentists in that, because the aim is to try and provide a support structure and a kind of area of inspiration and shared knowledge for those of us who don't necessarily have that clear career framework. And I guess it started out being PhD researchers and early postdoctoral researchers, but we now are much more inclusive, and we have lots of people who are pre-doctoral or even just research curious, shall we say.
I like that.
We're quite strict about people not being too experienced postdoctorally. So we're not talking about like professors or people who, might end up examining you in your Viva or something like that.
Does that mean I'm going to get kicked out?
I don't. This is something we actually haven't discussed or agreed yet, because obviously, obviously people's careers do move, and so you start to have these more requests, and it might be something that we need to reflect on in terms of membership, as to whether we do actually open out even more and continue to have the people who've been members for a really long time and are just that much further along. The
like
idea
an
is
alumni.
And the structure of the kind of group is changing. There's some exciting work going on at the moment to try and make us a little bit more strategic, and to look more at kind of what are the barriers and facilitators around being clinical academic, clinician, researcher, whatever you want to call us. And me and Ruth and Marianne, who's not orthoptist, who's Marianne Coleman, who's also been on the committee for quite a long time, are moving to kind of board level membership, and we've got some new community managers coming in just to try and keep things a bit fresher. And but it is a really, I have to say, I think, despite my reservations initially about using Facebook, because I did have some, and I think it is a limit. I think there are some people that won't join because of that. We've got, I think we've got over 800 members now. It's international. It's not just for UK-based researchers, and I think it's a really supportive, really helpful community and resource. And the questions that get asked now are just brilliant, and people are so responsive and prepared to give their advice or their experience. And there's definitely been some networking and those sorts of things. So
I know for me, when I stumbled on it, I think it was through like Twitter or somewhere. I don't remember how I stumbled on it, but I was just like, yay, I found like my tribe, and just such a massive sense of belonging, because I was in a very different situation from you were, down in Portsmouth. And I mean, I've built up a network there now, but when I first started, I definitely felt very much more like Billy No Mates. And so to stumble across this community, and I think you're right. Like, although Facebook has its drawbacks, I think as a closed group, It is potentially free and accessible to everybody, where like sometimes forums can go a little bit whatever, and I agree, like it's a completely very, very supportive group, and something I'm very, very proud to be a part of. But the thought of getting kicked out is now
that really hasn't come up yet, but it's crossed my mind, and I think Ruth's brought it up as well. So I think it's something that we'll discuss. I suspect we'll just or we'll kind of, expand the membership a little bit. And as long as you don't have the title of professor, we'll be okay. I don't know.
But I think it's an important thing to think about, and I think like I've started thinking about it as well, like not so much in terms of hyper, but like as I sort of transitioned into like the postdoc space, I have purposely not been as active on it, and it's not because I don't feel welcome there, but I don't want to. The postdoc realities, again, it's not something I'm trying to hide. I'm very vocal about it on my social media accounts, but I also, like, especially for those who are research curious, I don't want to dissuade them from my own challenges. And I think as a sort of research curious to PhD space, it's such a supportive, helpful workspace. So maybe we just need to get like another space for all of us who are like who started like in hyper and are now graduating up.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a really lovely space, and for anyone who isn't a member and wants to join, we really are we're quite careful about who we allow to join. So you have to answer some questions. You aren't allowed to join unless you answer the questions. If the answers to the questions kind of don't give us enough detail, we'll follow up to sort of check things. We certainly don't let people join just to post research adverts or kind of try and recruit to research. So if we feel that that might be why someone's interested in the group, we will offer to kind of post the advert on their behalf if they've got the appropriate ethics, but we won't just say, yeah, come along. And because what we want is people who will join and be active, relatively active members of the community. And I think, it's like any group, there's obviously some people who are more active than others. And I'm sure that there are some people who do just sit there and prefer to kind of just, read what comes through or know that it's there in the background, but aren't as involved. But I hope for those people who are engaging in the conversations that it's useful.
Well, from my perspective, I think even now that I'm not as actively engaging in the conversations, you know, it's still a place where I feel at home. And it's still a place where I feel like if there was something that I wanted to talk about, like a challenge that I was facing or something that I felt that the group as a whole would benefit from, then I wouldn't have an issue raising it. It's for me, I think I've just transitioned a bit because of who I am. For everybody who's out there, if you haven't come across it before, what we will do is in the description of the episode, we'll put a link in there, and then all you need is a Facebook account. And like Gemma has described, it is a closed space. So your post won't be visible to anybody on Facebook other than those people who are in the group. And the thing I really liked that the group offers, and like the people, the admin who run the group, is if, for example, you had something that was, a bit more of a scary conundrum, there have been instances where you've facilitated like anonymous posts and anonymous questions where one of the admin will ask the question, so that if it were not contentious, but just something you didn't want tied to your name, that is a possibility. It's a beautiful safe space for people who are research curious or who are on that PhD journey to really dive into some of those challenges about doing research as a healthcare professional.
Yeah.
Excellent. So with that in mind, I saw it wasn't recently in the couple of weeks, that you have published a paper with a couple of other people about clinical academics specific to people in your professional background. So those SLT, the speech language pathologists, therapists, I always get it mixed up. Which is it?
It's different in different countries. That's why. In the UK,
maybe that's why I get it mixed up, because
and
I'm like,
in Canada,
I'm North American by background, but then I'm like UK, and now I'm in Norway as well. So I'm like, this is talking.
I don't know what it is in Norway, but yeah,
Neither do I.
It doesn't matter. SLT, SLP. Same
Okay,
difference.
SLT or SLP. So tell us a little bit about, because that's not, for everybody who doesn't know Gemma, that's not what she specializes in for her own personal program of research. So how did you come to be involved in that paper, and sort of like, what were you hoping to discover in that paper?
So it came about from another group that I was on the committee for, that I actually am no longer, but I was at the time. The clinical excellence, so it was the clinical excellence network in speech and language therapy. So speech and language therapy has lots of clinical excellence networks. They're kind of like SIG, special interest groups, they used to be called. And I was for a while the secretary of, or the co-secretary of clinician, as it gets called. And we did we sort of ran study afternoons virtually, because it started just before COVID, so everything kind of became very virtual, and also that's quite good for access for people across the country. And it was a SEM for speech and language therapists who, again, are research curious, research active, anything to do with research really. And we had so much interest, and we ran a few, I think, very good study days about different subjects around kind of existing in a research space as a speech and language therapist. And then we submitted a couple of abstracts to a couple of different conferences, including the RCSLT conference and a European speech and language therapy conference, about the work that we were doing. And they were successful, and we did a couple of oral presentations. So I was the first author on these, so I did the presentations, but obviously the whole committee were behind me. And then I ended up having a conversation with Kate Harrell, who is a long-term colleague and very good friend of mine, who's also on the committee. And she was talking about, we should look at maybe writing up these sort of conference presentations into some sort of paper, or see if we can progress them in that way. And we, through sort of iterative discussion, as these things often as these things often happen, it became quite a big narrative review of the different, and I'm going to have to remember this, because frameworks, structures, and kind of resources that are available for speech and language therapists interested in embarking upon a clinical academic career. So we essentially reviewed the literature, and it wasn't a systematic review. It was very much a kind of like, what's out there, what can we pull out? We obviously had clear exclusion, inclusion criteria, and all of those good, robust academic things. But we then, Kate was very much the driving force of this project. And we brought on another couple of members of the committee, Emma Louise Sinnott and Lucy Roebuck Sayers, who helped us with sort of the once we'd got past data extraction and we're looking at the sort of tables and all of those bits and pieces. And it ended up being called, I think this was Kate's idea, could you give me a leg up? And then a sort of review of the different, as I say, resources essentially that are available to the profession, because like in many like for many AHPs and nurses and midwives, research is becoming just more and more popular as a potential career direction. And I don't think people are always as sure about how to start, where to start, how to determine what research skills they do or don't have. And I just think, I'm hoping it is incredibly useful to someone who's sort of thinking about making those steps into research, or someone who's further along in their research career and is kind of trying to work out how to prove to their manager, their team, that the skills that they're bringing because of their research abilities. So yeah, it was very much a side project. It was done in a lot of evenings, and but it was, I hope, really, it will be really valuable, and I think it potentially has value to people outside of speech and language therapy as well, because a lot of the tools aren't speech and language therapy specific, because that doesn't really exist. So
well, that's the thing I was going to say is I've done a speed read of it in preparation for our little chat today, and like I was like, oh, there were bits of it that I found myself being like, that could be really helpful or useful. So I think as a really good starting point. And again, I'll put the link to the paper in the description for this podcast for everybody who's listening out there or watching. I think it's a really like practical guide, like how do you do this? Because I think that's one of the things, like for me, and we've already alluded to it, is and I think it's probably a bit of a hangover from like the academic ivory towers of researchers that I think the more that people are doing it, they're like, well, no, it's actually just asking questions and finding answers to those questions. But I think there's still quite a big stigma, especially in non-medic healthcare professionals. The amount of people I've spoken to, both in this podcast and outside of this podcast, who are like, oh no, I'm not clever enough for research. I'm not this, I'm not that. And so I think as a foundational piece, it's a really good like breaking down of how do you get that leg up. And like that's why I love it. I like that. It makes it more accessible to those individuals who might be research curious. So yeah, no, great side project.
Yeah, it was fun. It was really fun. It was lovely to work with Kate, who is wonderful, and and definitely deserves the most credit for pulling it all together. So yeah.
Well, maybe I'll have to hit her up and have her come
Yeah,
on.
you should. She's definitely an interesting person to talk to, actually.
Ooh, maybe, yeah. Well, we'll connect about that after the podcast, because otherwise I'll get distracted. And we're almost out of time. Like it just flies by so fast this hour. So just reflecting back, so you yourself progressed from English literature to being a clinical researcher, a clinical academic within SLP, SLT. Um, what next?
Don't know. Have you got some sort of like magic ball or
Well, I'm just thinking, so I'm actually
I
like,
don't know. I am in a very much a period of uncertainty and flux in my own research. And I think, like a lot of people after my PhD, it's been quite a challenging space to kind of navigate and to work out what do I want to do for myself as a clinician, for myself as a researcher. What are the next steps in terms of just practically, and as you alluded to very early on, I am in the middle. Well, I'm just finishing a Delphi study to establish a core outcome set for laryngotracheal stenosis, which is the condition that I completed my PhD kind of investigating in terms of swallowing and voice. So that is a piece of research that is sort of ongoing for me, and I need to finish up. But I'm also interested in exploring some avenues within head and neck cancer, which is actually where I'm working clinically now, including, looking at use of ultrasound, but also looking at kind of qualitative methods with that population, which is sort of something that I quite enjoyed about my PhD. I've just started a short fellowship with the Patient Experience Research Centre at Imperial.
oh wow,
which is a day a week, and that is fascinating, and I'm really enjoying and learning a lot from the researchers there, who include, as well as the sort of the Professor Helen Ward, there is also a Professor of anthropology and sort of social scientists working there. So they have a very different way of viewing healthcare research, which is fascinating to learn from. And obviously, it's also a public health kind of basis as well, which is very different to what I've been used to. So I'm learning there at the moment.
So watch this space.
So yeah, I honestly I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you what I'll be doing in like 6 months, a year. You know, this is my first year without at the moment without a conference to go to or without an abstract to present. I've published all my PhD papers. That's all done. So I feel like I'm taking a bit of a moment. I have 2 kids. I have a husband who's doing a master's in psychotherapy. I sort of probably just need a little bit of time to not do and to just be.
But I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think one of the things, so the episode that just came out last week, who is somebody who I've known from like my master's days, and something she said, I think really rang true to me, because I think as a nurse researcher, having just finished your PhD, because there isn't that pathway, there's a lot of pressure, and I'm sure you feel this as well, to like secure a blah, 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 NIHR higher postdoc level grant. And I think even with the most supportive of PhDs, there was a bit of me who was like, I just need to breathe, and I need to figure out that space. And something that Anita said in the previous episode that I really liked is to give yourself space. So she would, between her master's and her PhD, she had a young child, and she stayed connected to the research world through like existing research programs that she had going on, and worked as a research assistant. And then when she was ready, she reinitiated, but she'd kept that connection. And I think we can do that as well, even though we finished a PhD, and keep that connection to the research world without necessarily needing to have like a huge NIHR successful, like more senior fellowship or RFPBs or whatever big grant coming in. I think taking that a bit of space, and like you, like I've done slightly different but similar, like I'm in a different country, I'm learning a different way of research, and like I'm growing so much. And I think it will help me in my career as I go on. But in a lot of ways, I am just kind of going, okay, let's just figure out where I am, where I want to go, and like go back to having a life.
I don't know if I've got time for that, but yeah, I do. I definitely agree. I think that there's something about sitting. I was fortunate. I got a Development Skills Enhancement Award almost like just after my PhD. So I had sort of another year of NIHR funding, which ends actually in like 2 days. And I did a bridging scheme as well. So I really did, like you say, that momentum just kept carrying me. And I think it's only now, 18 months after I finished, that I am very conscious of the need to be a little bit more careful about the decisions that I'm taking and my reasons for them, and the projects that I get involved with need to just be the right projects. So we'll see. Watch this.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful way to sort of end this, because it's brilliant advice, whether you're in a PhD or whether you're postdoc or whether you're research curious, is actually, and it's something one of my supervisors encouraged me to do from the very beginning, of being like, setting out what are your research questions, and then any opportunity you have fielding them through those as a bit of a filter. So I love how you said it, like really be careful about what you choose to do, because especially once you finish your PhD, like I've never had more offers thrown at me than because people are just like, okay, come play, and you could end up doing 500 projects and then you have no life whatsoever. Excellent. Great advice. I love it. Right. Any last words before we start wrapping this up? Any top tips? Any for any research curious SLTs out there?
Yeah, don't be scared to be research curious, and don't be put off by the fact that there is a lot of structure being built in now to the sort of clinical academic trajectory, and there is a sort of expectation that you tick certain things off before you move on to the next thing. I didn't quite go about it like that. I don't think I'm particularly special to have been able to do that. I think there was an alignment of different circumstances perhaps, but ultimately what we do as clinicians when we're working, when we're completing an audit or a QI project or a service evaluation, so many of those things are transferable into research and can be developed into something more research focused. And that is often where the best questions come from. And also reach out to people who you respect, know about, and they'll probably really value that contact and be very happy to have a chat with you about what you could do to kind of explore whether being a clinical academic or a clinician researcher or whatever we're calling it is for you.
Oh, that's brilliant. What a fabulous way to end, Gemma. Thank you so much for being willing to come on and share your time and share your journey with me here on Researcher Revealed podcast. I really appreciate it. Everybody out there who's listened in, do make sure you check out the episode description. We'll put lots of resources, some of the papers that Gemma was talking about, that Facebook group link, all of those sorts of things so that you can really dive into it a little bit more if you found this episode interesting and you want to learn a little bit more. If you have specific questions for Gemma, what I would ask that you do is you go onto the YouTube channel and you leave them as comments, because that's the easiest way for me to field them, get them to Gemma so that we can then answer them through that same thing rather than trying to do emails or anything like that. So use the comment section in the YouTube video for this episode and we will get any questions answered for that. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, whether that's on YouTube or on your podcasting platform of choice, because it really helps grow this podcast and make sure that it gets out to more people who are interested just like you are. And with that, I think that's everything. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and experience, Gemma.
Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure. We'll see you again in 3 weeks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Don't go away. Up next, we have the top 3 takeaways from this week's podcast by Dr. Rosalind Austin. Like I said in the podcast, I've known of Gemma and have been a part of the hyper, not her. As we learned, it wasn't just her who created it. Thank you very much, Janet Jean, for making hyper possible. So I've known about her, but I haven't had the opportunity to get into her story to the degree that I did today. And I really enjoyed getting to hear about how she got into research. I find it really interesting that she's gone from English literature, which is all about language, into actually as a clinician, all about speech and language as well. So connected thread, even though quite different. So it's that time of the podcast. My top 3 takeaways from what Gemma shared with us. 1, and this is the first time that this has really come up in the podcast, is your location. So we've talked a lot about how people's exposure to research, either delivery or clinical audits, arose to them being interested in research. And I found it really interesting that for Gemma, it was totally different than that. So for her, it was about the location that she was in and the environment having both institutional structural support to develop as a clinical researcher, but also those role models. And I think that's a really, really important thing to consider. So nationally here in the UK, there's a lot more growth happening around how can we embed research into more clinical careers, especially those individuals who are non-medic. So nurses, midwives, AHPs, SLPs, clinical scientists, all of those sort of non-medic clinical careers. And while nationally there's a big push for that, depending on which hospital you're at, that can translate into a very different environment. And her experience and the additional support and opportunities that she's gotten because of where her journey was and the NHS trust that she was in really facilitated, and I like how she used that word, gave her the space to really explore research. So yeah, your location and considering your location before you start on a research journey is a really good thing to think about. Second takeaway for me is that the ongoing argument over what is a clinical academic. And I liked how she used the term clinical researcher, because academic can lead people to think that what you do is teach. And I think there's a growing movement around clinicians who are clinical academics to make sure that they hold on to the component of both clinical and research. And sometimes that means teaching as well, but to hold on to actually doing research. But I like how when she was discussing about it, she talked about how it is a very personal journey and what clinical academic looks like for you, depending on where you are, what you want to do, and also your availabilities within your institution. So to be much more clear about what you are rather than the term used to describe you. So I thought it was a really interesting perspective. And then finally, which goes back to one of the earlier episodes we had, which is a bit about collaboration, but she didn't really talk about this directly, but indirectly through the paper that we discussed that she was a part of, that the Give Me a Leg Up paper on how within speech language and pathology you can kind of get started into a researcher career. She talked about how she was a member, so founding member of Hyper on the initial group there, but she's also a member of lots of other clinically specific associations, and how those connections have led to, as she described it, side projects. And I think those are really important things to consider getting involved in, as long as it fits within your goals and your own sort of research interests. But that ability to be recognized within your professional bodies, nationally, internationally, as a clinician who is interested in research, that can be a real conduit for fostering collaborative relationships. So I think that's, again, a real thing to think about if you're research curious, or even if you're on your research journey, completing your PhD, about to finish your PhD and wanting to stay active in research, is look for opportunities. You don't have to be the chair, you don't have to be a secretary, you can just be a member of a professional association, and to connect in with other individuals nationally, internationally, or even within your own institution who, like you, have that clinical professional background, but who also are interested in film research around whatever area you're particularly interested in. So yeah, that's it for my top three takeaways. So your location and considering that before starting on your research journey, and how supportive that location will be. What you mean by the term clinical academic or clinical researcher, and really defining that down, not for anybody else, but for yourself. And then third, to get involved in your professional association to some degree, to increase that opportunity for research collaborations outside of your own institution, NHS or university. I hope you really enjoyed that episode. I know I did. I found it fascinating getting to find out the origin of the Hyper Facebook group. As always, and like I said in the podcast, there'll be more details in the episode description, both on YouTube as well as your podcasting platform of choice, with lots of links that will allow you to access the paper that Gemma was speaking about, get to read a little bit more about her research, as well as other little bits and pieces. So make sure you check that out. Remember also to like and subscribe either on YouTube or your podcasting platform of choice to really help boost this podcast and get these ideas out to more people, more clinicians like you. It will help grow the podcast, which will make it more feasible for me to continue doing this. And yeah, I would really appreciate it as well. I think that's it for now. I will see you all in another 3 weeks. Thanks so much for listening and follow her advice. Be curious, be brave, and just dive in. Always ask that question, why? And who knows, maybe you'll become a clinical researcher as well. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you later. Bye.